We get asked this constantly, like so much I could probably make a drinking game out of it. How are you still in the EU? Aren't you like way over your 90 days? Aren't you guys bending the rules for the rest of us? The short answer? No.
I'm Daria, this is Chris, and that's Jasper, and these are our seaworthy dogs, Hachi and Luna. This is our floating home, Ragdoll. For 2 years we called a 47-foot monohull a home. Now we've set sail on a chapter aboard a catamaran, embracing the beauty and chaos of life at sea. Full-time work, homeschooling, storms and sunsets, this is our reality. No script, no certainty, just wind, waves and the endless blue. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this episode.
We've been living full-time on our boat sailing the Mediterranean for over 2.5 years, and we have been doing so in a complete legitimate manner. Not a loophole, not a hack, it's just good old-fashioned EU law. Specifically, I'm referring to the Directive 2004-38-EC, which spells out the rights of EU citizens and their family members to live, work, travel and float their way across the Union. Now, quick disclaimer before we dive in. Yes, I have a background in law, but no, this video is in no way, shape or form any legal advice. I am not your lawyer, I am just a very organized sailor with deep love for EU law and color-coded spreadsheet. Everything I'm sharing with you today is grounded in actual law, and this is the Directive, the Schengen Borders Code and the EU Commission's Practical Handbook for Border Guards. And yes, that is indeed a real thing, and I've read it cover to cover twice. So this is also based on our own experiences of cruising the Mediterranean for the last 2.5 years while living on our boat. So that said, I want you to be mindful of the fact that immigration authorities in different countries can sometimes interpret things a little bit differently. So if you are planning on doing things a little bit different, I don't know, like a 6-month stay in one place or buying 14 goats in Greece, wherever floats your boat, see what I did there, just double check with your local authorities. Better to be safe than resident. We sail on a UK registered non-VAT paid boat. However, that is a whole separate can of bureaucratic worms that we're not going to open today, because that's not what this video is about. What we're talking about here is people on board and not the boat. The right to travel and reside in the EU under the Directive applies to individuals, not hulls. Your flag and VAT status might matter at customs, but they don't change your immigration rights. So for context, I'm a Polish citizen, therefore I have an EU passport. My husband's British, he's non-EU since Brexit, but he's lucky enough to be married to me. So as a family, we have been using the freedom of movement rights that come with my EU passport to legally stay in the EU. And yes, we are doing so completely by the book. So the directive lays out some very clear rights when it comes to entering and living in the EU. So EU citizens who decided to live in another member state, that's not their home country, and their non-EU family members who can tag along or join them later. So if this sounds like your situation, here's the good news. You have a solid legal right to be in the EU for more than 90 days and 180. So there's no sketchy loopholes, there's no dodgy paperwork, no crew lists involved, just straightforward rights granted by the EU. Simple as that. So let's look at the definition of family. According to Article 2 of the Directive, the following people qualify as family members with the right to live and travel in the EU. So it can be your spouse, and yep, that includes any person you're legally married to, a registered partner, if the country treats partnerships the same as marriage, children under the age of 21 who are dependent, and dependent parents or grandparents. And just in case, if you're wondering, this is reinforced in the Schengen Handbook. So if you fit any of these categories, you've got a green light to be in the EU with your EU citizen family member. So when we first sailed into the EU, we made sure to use a proper port of entry, as you should. And for us, it was A Coruña in Spain. And at that point, Chris and Jasper, being non-EU citizens, had their passports stamped just like the rules say to do so. So if you're in the same situation, remember that getting your passport stamped is not just a formality, it's part of the legal process. And the handbook section 6.2 on page 75 state that non-EU family members must have their passport stamped if they don't have a residence card issued under the directive. So once you're in the EU, you're free to roam without any internal border checks. It's like a VIP pass through a whole new bunch of countries. But don't get too comfy just yet, because you do still have to follow the legal rules. For example, Chris travels under my EU rights, not his own. So Chris has his own 9180 rights, and with me he has his 90 per member state rights. It's like he's hitching a ride to my EU citizenship, and let's just say he's not getting any frequent flyer miles from that. The Schengen Handbook section 2.1.2 states that the 90 days per member state rules applies when traveling with an EU citizen. Therefore, me. So while the internal borders are generally speaking non-existent, your travel rights definitely aren't. So do make sure to follow the rules that we're going to go over to keep you smooth sailing. So something that always catches people out is the 9180 rule. So when Chris and I travel together, he is not subject to the infamous Schengen 9180 rule that most people panic about. Instead, he can stay up to 90 days per country per member state. And the best part is that after he leaves the country for 90 days, the clock resets like a magical do-over button. This is reiterated in the Schengen Handbook and section 2.1.2, which says that consecutive periods of up to 3 months per state are accepted. But let's say Chris travels solo for work, which he does quite often in our case. Then his own personal 9180 rule kicks in. So the moment he separates from myself, his own 9180 clock starts and he's back to the normal Schengen rules. So the Schengen Handbook section 2.12 says that when the family member travels on their own, the normal 9180 rules apply. So as long as we are together, Chris gets the VIP treatment, but if he's off on his own, he has to play the usual Schengen game. So in the last 2.5 years, we've only been asked to prove our time in the EU twice. But when that moment came, we were, for the most part, ready. We demonstrate this by showing marina invoices showing when we entered and exit each country. We take out cash at an ATM when we arrive and exit the country, or take on fuel or anything of the sort. And we collect all these receipts to prove our entry and our exit, because who doesn't love collecting endless receipts, right? In addition to that, we have a super detailed color-coded spreadsheet that tracks where we've been, for how long, when we've left, what kind of our proof is for departure, be it a fuel receipt or an ATM, sometimes maybe a restaurant, we never know. As long as the receipt's got an address on it, I'm usually happy to use that. Having the documentation has tremendously helped us prove that we've stuck to the 90 rule in each member state. And while this isn't a legal requirement, it aligns with the Schengen Handbook's guidance on demonstrating movement during border check. I think it's section 6.2 in the practical enforcement notes that mentions this. So although it's not a legal requirement, we do try to do our best to make sure that we can prove that we've moved on at a time when we're supposed to move on, and we are not, taking advantage of the rules. So while we do rarely need it, we recommend keeping a simple log just in case. It's like a bureaucratic safety net. So as we've mentioned before, we arrived in A Coruña after doing the Bay of Biscay, and that's where our kind of port of entry into the EU was. Now, at the time, our dogs had the animal health certificates issued in the UK that we needed to get into the EU and back. However, the AHC, as it is called, is only valid for 4 months. So when we landed in A Coruña, we found a veterinarian who was happy to issue us 3 Spanish EU pet passport. And as long as we keep the rabies vaccination up to date, and we keep obviously their other vaccinations up to date, they are free to travel within the EU without any extra additional paperwork. So I hope this clears things up for you and makes EU sailing adventures a little bit less confusing. Now we're going to dive into some of the awesome questions you guys have sent over on Instagram, so get ready to get your burning questions answered. So we've covered the basics of family rights, staying longer than 90 days, passport stamps, and some real life tips. So let's jump into the Q&A. Do I need a visa as a UK spouse? So no. So I mean, UK citizens don't need a visa to enter Schengen in the first place. So if you are from a visa exempt country, no, you do not need a visa to travel with your EU citizen spouse. Again, this is backed up in the directive under Article 5. You can also find it in the handbook at section 2.8.2. Do I need a residence card? Unless you are staying more than 90 days in any one country continuously, you are not expected to get residency card. The 90 days is kind of a free flow limit. Do non-EU family members get their passports stamped, and why? Okay, so yes, unless you have a residence card, your passport will be stamped under the directive. The Schengen Handbook, page 75, section 6.2 also explains that although you will be stamped in, as long as you can prove at a border check later on that your extended time in the EU was with your spouse, it shouldn't be a problem. This is also why I've been recommending the spreadsheet and kind of logging your time everywhere and making sure you have enough proof to back up what you're saying if you are checked at a border point. Can a non-EU spouse work? So it depends on the host country's implementation. Under Article 23 of the Directive, family members may work, but require registration or permits in certain extent. So this video is not really going to be covering working as a non-EU spouse of an EU citizen. It gets a little bit more complicated. We are sticking to the whole 90 days and moving on and cruising in the Schengen without any tax implication or residency. If you are separated, if you're traveling separately, then the regular 9180 Schengen rule applies and free movement protections no longer apply. Are receipts and logs legally required? Like I said, they are not a legal requirement in any way, shape or form, but they are very useful in improving movement between countries when you're utilizing EU spouse rights. What happens if you overstay in one country? So you might lose your rights under the directive and become subject to local immigration enforcement, and that's outlined in Article 6 and 7 of the directive. Can you stay in the EU forever this way? You absolutely can. So as long as you comply with the 90-day rule per country and travel together, you can utilize this rule indefinitely. So what about a boat being non-VAT? So like I said at the beginning of the video, this is not quite the video for this. VAT is a customs matter, and as long as the boat complies with EU customs, VAT rules, or the temporary admission and 18-month reset, that's fine. However, none of it affects your immigration rights until such a point that you become resident in any one country, and residency is kind of the first step in getting across to a chargeable event, which is what needs to happen for your VAT to become payable in the country. However, like I said, this is not a video on that. If it's something you're interested in, I'm more than happy to put something together on that. But generally speaking, non-VAT pay boat doesn't relate to your actual immigration status. I'm a bit confused by this one. We've been asked if our dogs need new paperwork for every border. So the answer is no. As long as they have an EU issued pet passport, they can travel freely between EU countries. And this was the same for British pets before Brexit. Nothing has changed in the EU in that respect. As long as they have a pet passport that is valid, as long as a rabies vaccination remains valid, pets can travel indefinitely through the EU without much fuss. There's a couple of places like Malta that require certain warming treatments before entering, but generally speaking, all they need is a passport. Do I need to check into every country? Now, if you're arriving from outside of the EU, yes, you need to enter a port of entry to check into Schengen. However, once you're in the EU, that is you. Schengen has no borders, that's the whole point of it. So as long as you're checked into one country in the EU, that's fine. That you don't need to get stamped in and out of each country. Can I be denied entry as a non-EU spouse? Now, I'm not really sure why that's been asked, because the only time that you would be denied entry is if you're a public threat. Your right to accompany your husband, wife, partner, your spouse is very strongly protected under the directive. Do I need health insurance? Not required for short stays under 90 days per country technically, but highly advisable because things happen, and if you're clumsy like me, then you will definitely use it. You talk about all these laws, but are border guards aware of them? Well, not always. So that's why it helps to print the directive and the handbook sections that are relevant to spouse rights and have them handy and organized at check-ins. We also have copies of the documents on board, so that should we ever be checked at anchor or a quayside, which we have, we can easily pull them out and show them. We also have them translated into various languages, so we always have a copy in English and in the language of the country in which we're currently in. What if we're challenged? Well, first of all, stay calm because you're not doing anything wrong. I advise you to show your travel logs, your marriage certificate, your passport, and politely explain that you're traveling under the directive and refer the border guards to the handbook sections 2.1.2 if needed. How can a non-EU spouse stay in the EU longer than 90 days without breaking the law? So under the directive, if you are a non-EU spouse accompanying your EU spouse, you are not bound by the 9180 Schengen tourist rule. Instead, you are allowed to stay up to 90 days per member state in each country, provided you are traveling together. Now, this is also confirmed in the Schengen handbook in section 2.1.2 and articles 6 and 7 of the directive. Your rights apply across Schengen, but reset per country and are not EU-wide. Is this really legal? We've been told we're overstaying. Yes, it is completely legal. Everything I've said here is based on the directive and the Schengen Border Guards handbook, which you can find a copy online, and I'll try and pop a link to it in the description below. Now, we've had our documents checked a couple of times, like I've mentioned previously, and the last 2.5 years, and both times we've had to provide marriage certificates, passport stamps, marina receipts, ATM slips, and I even had to show Jasper's birth certificate to show that he is indeed my son. And that was it. No fines, no issues. It just takes a little bit of explaining sometimes if the border guards are not entirely familiar with what you're talking about. And of course, language barriers don't really help the situation. Hence, it does help to have it translated into the language that you're currently using in the country where you're staying at. Does the 90 days start again when you leave Schengen altogether? Not for family members traveling with an EU spouse. So the 90 days per country allowance applies individually to each member state. So you don't need to leave the EU in its entirety for that clock to reset. You just need to move from one country to another within the EU every 90 days, and then you're legally staying within the EU under Article 6 of the directive. What do you use to prove where you've been? So we keep a travel log with dates of entry and exit per country, per member states. We save ATM receipts, marina invoices, and any official documentation like fuel receipts with timestamps, etc. We also use a spreadsheet to track how long we've stayed in each country, and this kind of helps us show compliance with the rules and show that we're not taking advantage of them. Can you stay longer than 90 days in a country if you want to?
Yes, you absolutely can, but it gets a little bit more legally complicated. So if you stay longer than 90 days in any one country, you start to fall under the remit of Article 7 of the Directive, which means you're now applying for residency. Now, applying for residency can start your tax residency clock, depending on sort of local laws. And this can impact you, especially if you are working elsewhere overseas, if your boat is non-VAT paid or non-EU flagged, or if you're trying to avoid becoming fiscally resident in a member state. So this is why we deliberately try to stay under 90 days per country to avoid triggering that. Once you're over your 90 days, countries can legally ask you about your income, insurance, and more. And like I say, you are on the clock to become a tax resident, which happens after you are in a country for more than 182 days in any one given financial year of that country. Once you are a tax resident, VAT becomes payable. You can get double taxed on your income if you're working elsewhere. It's a whole new can of bureaucratic worms that we're just not going to open in this video, because I think it's a video in its own right. What's the role of the practical handbook for border guards in all of this? The Schengen handbook is the document border agents are instructed to use to assess situations just like this one. It reaffirms the rights of the EU citizens. It defines what documents need to be checked. It outlines procedures for stamping passports. It essentially provides the border guards with an outline of the law and how should they proceed in particular circumstances. What if border guards don't believe you? I think we've had a question on it being challenged, and I think that's kind of falls the same answer. It is rare, but it can happen, and as long as you stay calm and you present your marriage certificate, your passport, birth certificate, your travel logs, your receipts, the directive excerpts, and maybe a note from the Schengen Borders Handbook, you're absolutely fine. This has always cleared things up for us. In some cases, agents just weren't familiar with the law, and being prepared just makes all the difference. So I hope this has helped. I hope this has clarified some things for you. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them down in the comment section below. And till next time. If you've got any questions or thoughts, leave them in the comment section below. We always love hearing from you. Thanks for watching. Till next time.